Welcome to Cycle 3, Part 1, From Practice to Performance in our series Proficiency and Literacy, World Language Learning, and the Common Core. We are finally to the third cycle of this year, and I think you will find this one particularly enjoying because we're getting a little more down and dirty with your everyday job as a language teacher. But let's start by looking at our learning targets for this cycle, and we are looking at to design a series of learning tasks in the interpersonal and presentational speaking mode, and developing a unit performance assessment, both as a formative as well as a summative assessment in the interpersonal and presentational speaking mode. And how we're going to get there? Well, we're taking a little different approach by having these videos divided into 3 parts. In this video, part 1, I will try to make the case how we have to make a better connection between how we're teaching and how we're assessing. In part 2, we will take a look at how to develop a performance assessment. And in part 3, finally, for those brave enough, we will end with an IPA model for performance assessment. And no, I am not talking about beer, but about what is possible when all the pieces of performance assessments truly come together. So as we conclude this cycle, I want to take us back just a little bit to the beginning of the year, where we started talking about several high-level concepts. We talked about frameworks and principles that outline effective language teaching and effective language learning. But in order to implement all of those ideas, we have to make some important connections. So in order to do that, let's begin by seeing how we got here and identify what else is missing. We started by talking about the Common Core, and we took a look at this statement. I think you recall it. Students must have ample opportunities to take part in a variety of rich, structured conversations as part of a whole class in small groups and with a partner. Built around important content in various domains. They must be able to contribute appropriately to these conversations, to make comparisons and contrasts, and to analyze and synthesize a multitude of ideas in accordance with the standards of evidence appropriate to a particular discipline. And when we looked at that Common Core statement, we talked about how it accurately describes what some of our goals are in a world language classroom. Everything from having conversations, using the language, talking about meaningful things, and of course making comparison and contrast to our own culture and of course the cultures that we're studying. And we started to make some connection, of course, of the standards of evidence, which in our case was proficiency. Then we took a further look at Common Core and we noticed these trends in the anchor statements. I hope you recall that we talked about comprehension, collaboration, and the presentation of knowledge and ideas, which align perfectly with our modes of communication, right? Comprehension, of course, being the interpretive mode, collaboration, of course, being the interpersonal mode, and our students present their knowledge and ideas through the presentational mode. So that was our connection, again, to the Common Core standards. And then we try to look at that proficiency piece. So if the Common Core standards are, and of course the world readiness standards, really talk about or frame the what our students are learning, then we could argue that proficiency gives us guidance on how to identify how well our students are learning and how we can measure their growth as language learners. Just as a reminder, here is the proficiency definition that we used. Proficiency is the ability to use language in real-world situations in a spontaneous interaction and non-rehearsed context, and in a manner acceptable and appropriate to native speakers of the language. So then if proficiency outlines the how well for what the Common Core and World Language Standards is saying is broken down into our learning targets, then we just have that question that's left, right? And that is, how will we assess our learners? And that is the focus of this third cycle in the series. So let me take you back just a little bit, including to my own teaching, and I'll share a story about that. Just imagine this. A test that includes reading comprehension questions, fill in the blank with correct grammatical structures and vocabulary, maybe some multiple choice questions. Have you ever given an assessment like that? Perhaps you even had to take an assessment like that. I know both of those statements are true for me. I used to give those very tests to my students because I didn't know how to assess any other way. But if you think about this kind of test, what are you really assessing here? Are you assessing knowledge, achievement, or are you assessing performance? And so in order for us to make a right decision, I just thought, well, let's look in a dictionary and see. According to Webster, knowledge applies to facts and ideas acquired by study, investigation, observation, or experience. So what is the role of knowledge in a world language classroom? And don't think because I'm asking this, I mean there's no role at all. But what is the role and what value do we put it in assessment? Again, according to Webster, when we're talking about achievement, we're talking often about a test, often in some kind of standardized format, for measuring a student's mastery of a given subject, or maybe even skill. So what role does mastery play in a world language class? Now, mind you again, what we learned about proficiency, proficiency is that continuum in a never-ending continuum of performances. So then what role does performance play? Well, isn't that the ultimate goal of any language learner, using a language? So demonstrating what the students can do with the language, and wasn't that the whole point of writing our learning targets in cycle 1 and cycle 2, in that can do based on the modes of occasion aligned to the proficiency guidelines format. So we got to be really careful and think about that our assessment sends some very powerful messages to our learners. And what do we want them to value? The knowledge, the achievement, or the performance when learning a second language? Speaking of learner, what would happen if I talk to your students right now and ask them a couple questions? The first question is, how do you learn best? How do you think your student would likely respond to that question? Well, I would be shocked if they didn't say what most students say. They learn best through playing games, skits, singing songs, music, video, reading, all those things where they get to use the language. And yes, some of the students probably would also list homework and worksheets, but my guess is those would probably be the minority. So those are all the things where students learn language. They're actually using language in a real-life context. Singing a song is also a real-life context. Playing a game is. So then when I ask them a second question, how does your teacher assess you? How does the teacher find out how well you are doing? Then what would they say? Well, if they were my students 20 years ago, they'd probably say test and quizzes. So we have a major disconnect between how the students are learning the language and how we're assessing it. And if we think that all these activities that we have designed are motivating students to learn, because why else would we design them, then why would we use a format that's not motivating students to assess their level of performance? So we've got to get to a point where we can create a mirror image between how the students are learning and how the teacher assesses them. Robert Terry once said, any good teaching strategy is a good assessment strategy. And that is very much true. We often think of assessment as this end-of-the-road thing, as something that comes as a final thing to prove. But assessment can happen every single day. And in my work with teachers, I've been trying to encourage teachers now to think about You can do a performance assessment every single day. Don't freak out, it's okay. But you're likely already doing many of those activities that are just good performances and that allow students to use language. If that's the kind of activities you're using, those truly are already performance assessments. Of course, in this cycle, we'll be looking at some of the more formal performance assessments and the structure of them. So, I hope I made a good enough case about what the role of performance assessment is and how we should be using them more. But if not, here are a couple more ideas to kind of spark your thinking. So there are some powerful quotes which I hope will lead us right into our first video task. And so let's have a little chat, because there were some quotes that I think most teachers could agree with, but maybe some take some issue with some of them, and that allows us to have a nice conversation. So here's your assignment for this first video task. In your group, have an honest chat about assessment in your classroom. Talk about what your current process looks like. And it's okay if you are doing some of those things that I just identified as maybe not being the most effective form of assessment. But then the second half of it, discuss how this process in your classroom could, so this is subjunctive for you language teachers, right? Hypothetically, ensure that testing is not a gotcha, but rather a celebration of work. How can we design assessments that shift that focus from these are all the things that you got wrong, to wow, look at what you can do already with the language? Because that is the real benefit of using performance assessments. After you complete this task, you can watch video number 2 in the cycle, and I'll be right back with you.